are Vineyard.
Somos Viña.
We are Vineyard.
And then I just came to discover, as I'm reading in the tradition of sort of the Western intellectual tradition, which is what most of my particular work was in, that a lot of these people had been church leaders. The church had produced a ton of really significant thinkers in philosophy and in science and in history and in any number of things, obviously theology as well. And it just gave me an imagination for the connection between Christian faith and, in the best sense, humanities. Yeah. Right? I saw that these disciplines are connected, which of course totally makes sense. I mean, if we believe that the Lord
made the people,
people, it should fit together. But there's a kind of fundamentalism or a kind of, even frankly, there's just a tilt in certain parts of evangelical culture, which hadn't really been mine exactly. But it was in the water a little bit to wonder, what's the point of doing all this kind of thinking if what you're really made for is ministry? Why would you spend your time going to that kind of school or doing those kinds of classes? I just had none of that. And boy, it just lit me up.
In today's episode, our host Jay Pathak talks to Caleb Maskell, Associate National Director of Theology and Education for Vineyard USA. Let's listen in.
All right, Caleb, thanks for joining us on our podcast.
It's good to be here in my office.
In your office. It was a long journey.
It was.
To get, well, and in some ways it kind of has been a long journey to get to this office, but I'm excited to do this because we did the one podcast where we tried to review previous podcasts.
Yeah, I'm told that was the least popular of all of our podcasts.
It was the worst one by a lot.
We're like, this is dumb. I'm not listening to this.
That's when we decided,
never do that.
We're not going to do that again. Yeah. So we've been learning. So instead.
Sorry, everybody.
Yes. So now you get to actually be a guest, like a real guest, not in the background laughing, because you've been in a few of those too.
It's true.
But now you're actually a guest.
So good to be a guest.
It's a big deal.
It's good to be your guest in my office.
In my office. Exactly. Okay. So we begin where all things begin for Caleb, which is where you were born and grew up.
Yeah. I was born in England. I grew up in London, and I lived there till I was 9 years old. So my parents are British. And my brother and I have a younger brother, Sam, who is 2 years younger than me. My brother and I and my parents moved from when I was 9, moved to South Jersey, Philadelphia.
As you
suburbs.
do when you're a Brit, you moved to South Jersey.
Oh yeah, it was a perfect fit. It was just like hand in glove. Frankly, I was perfectly made for moving from a little boys' school in Southwest London, where I had like a little red blazer and the shorts. I basically looked like Angus Young from AC/DC, and learned Latin, and I had a rock collection and did all the things that little English schoolboys do. And I moved in 1986 to South Jersey, which was then the land of Bon Jovi. Slippery When Wet had just come out, and street hockey, and all kinds of things that I knew nothing about. The only common language between where I came from and where I went to was that there was still fighting. So there was a lot of fighting in the boys' school, and there was a lot of fighting in the school that I moved into in the U.S. as well. But that was less good because I was 9 years old in 5th grade, which was ahead. I was ahead of the game.
Yeah, I was going to say I don't think that's the right.
No, it's not the normal match. It's because the English schools, you start younger in English schools,
right? And
also I had skipped a grade, which I don't recommend to anyone, but I was, 2 years younger than everybody else. So the fights were tougher as well.
And what did your dad do and your mom that made them decide to move?
I think my parents basically had the American dream or a version of it.
Right.
Growing up, my dad, he worked for Xerox. And so he had a 2-year project in Rochester, New York, where Xerox was based. And so we all came over. My brother was actually born in Rochester at that time. But then we moved back after that assignment was done. And I think when they lived there, they just loved it. They just loved American culture. They were the first Christians in their family, or at least like the first kind of converted Christians in their family. And I think they thought of the U.S. as like a land where there were lots of good church options, and it was kind of lots more opportunity as well. This was, Margaret Thatcher's Britain in the early 80s, mid 80s. And I think a lot of the kind of class tensions felt really strong. So they saw coming to the States as an opportunity to live a different kind of life. And so my dad, I think, just basically looked for an opportunity and moved.
So they wanted to be in America.
Yeah. My dad, I think, he was a business consultant. He was an accountant, but in his heart, he's kind of a romantic. And I think he loved Woody Guthrie, and he loved Bob Dylan, and he loved John Steinbeck and all those kind of American 20th century novels. And so he would just, I think, imagine his way into, this land is your land. And one day it just kind of, he couldn't shake it.
Right.
So he ended up here truly for that reason. I mean, life was fine in England. I think, it's the class structures are different in England, or at least certainly were in those days. I don't really know how it is now, but I think my parents felt a little bit like they were fighting through some of that to get to what they hoped for them and for me and my brother.
Right.
And I think the U.S. sort of promised something different from that too. And also, I mean, it's a cultural advantage to be an Englishman in the United States.
Totally.
Right? Everybody thinks you're smart because of your accent.
Yes.
There are just upsides to being from England and America. So I think they saw that and enjoyed all of it.
Yeah, you start ahead.
Yeah, you do.
You really do. Yeah. Okay. So they come and they're believers. They have life with Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in charismatic house churches in England. So my parents, to tell the story briefly, had both come to faith when they were at the University of Sussex in Brighton. And there was some sort of campus revival, as I understand it, some sort of like awakening moment. They both came to faith, and that's where they met. And ultimately, they got married and they started going to church. It was I don't actually understand quite the nature of the network, but it was a thing in the UK in the 70s and 80s, these kind of house church networks.
Yeah.
Maybe still is in some part of the country. But, church, it was kind of like a combination between a Pentecostal church and a Quaker meeting in the sense that there was a lot of sort of egalitarian leadership, right? There was no pastor. The elders would preach.
Right.
As far as I could tell, the worship was kind of spontaneous. There was a piano guy and he would be called upon to play songs by people in the room. So I think he was just good at the piano, and people would say, sing this one.
He'd have to be.
Yeah, right. It was cool. And it was actually pretty wonderful. And then there would be biblical teaching of varying quality depending on which elder was up for the day. And then prayer. So when it worked, it was beautiful. And when it didn't work, it was catastrophic.
Right. Totally.
No, and I don't just mean on a Sunday. I mean, even the leadership elements of it occasionally tended towards chaos. And, there was church splits and things like that. It's amazing how easy it is for a group that has totally egalitarian leadership to become subject to tyranny.
Yes, totally.
And so some of that happened. And there's some difficult times. But in the end, I grew up aware of a living God. I don't think I knew that God loved me in the way that I do now. But that wasn't anybody's fault. It was just I knew that God existed and was interested in my life in a way that really never went away.
Yeah.
And that's a great gift. My parents also taught me the scriptures. My dad, because he was converted, and also because he's just like a wise person who really wanted to raise his children well, had a high commitment to teaching me scripture. And my mom actually taught me to read at a very young age. That's part of why I ended up skipping a grade, but the unintended consequence. But taught me to read at a young age so that I could read the Bible. And they also told me that my name was significant from when I was born. as long as I can remember, they said, the Lord, we prayed what we should call you, and we felt we should call you Caleb. And Caleb's a super popular name now, but when I was growing up, I was the only Caleb I knew. Like for probably 20 years, I don't think I knew another one. And so I had an awareness not just of the Bible, but also of the significance of the story of the Bible for understanding the story of my life.
Yeah.
And that waxed and waned. I mean, I had some hard times. I really essentially wasn't walking with God. I almost kind of came back to faith much later in my childhood. But that was something they gave me early that stuck.
Yeah. That's so cool to think. And I mean, again, we've talked about this a lot, but how, because the whole house church thing, honestly doesn't really make sense in my mind for how I've understood church, just personally, having come to know Jesus the way I did, and then loving being in these environments where I bring my friends and do all this stuff. But that's sort of predicated on a different set of things, which is fine. I mean, it's not bad. It's just, do you have memories of being in that stuff when you were a kid, or is that? Yeah,
I mean, I always think of two sort of vivid memories. One is the church didn't meet in a house; it met in like a town hall kind of thing, like a gym basically, but a room that you would like. Maybe you go vote there when it's voting time, or that kind of all-purpose community room. And so I have vivid memories of the music, and then people receiving prayer. The prayer wasn't like Vineyard style. It was much more like kind of intense.
Right.
So, I remember a couple times, people getting prayer, and I'm thinking, wow, there's like something going on over there that I kind of should pay attention to, but I really don't want to get involved.
Right.
And then the other memory I have is there was a home group at someone's house. My parents' friends, Ian and Maggie Suter. We went to their house, and there was like a kids thing, and we were singing like Father Abraham has many sons, and marching around the living room of this place, and it was so sweet, and it, like I said, when it was great, yeah, but it wasn't really designed with longevity in mind, right? And I also think, in England, my experience was that I thought that I was the only Christian that I knew in my school. Now that I'm sure was not true, but that's how it felt. And I think the traditional churches, the Roman Catholic Church or the Anglican Church, which is everywhere in view, right? I mean, you can't walk down a street in England hardly without, or a town street without seeing a church, were considered to be sort of less than, right? I mean, this is a story that I think was just dead wrong. I mean, you think about all that's happening in the Anglican Church and other things, Roman Catholic Church.
But you guys were like the super spiritual kingdom warriors.
Well, there was an element of that. There was definitely an element of knowing that we were over against. And some of that was actually kind of good.
Sure.
Right? It's prepared me a little bit for some of the cultural shifts we've been experiencing, over the last 20 years.
Yep.
But there was a sense that to be a Christian was to be different in some way, right? I mean, I remember in my house, we would often talk in terms like, well, what do Christians do about X, Y, or Z? Like, how do Christians talk to one another? How do Christians vote? How do Christians, whatever.
Work?
Exactly. Yeah. And so there was a sense of difference, which was simultaneously helpful and a little alienating.
Sure,
right?
Yeah.
Because I bet if we had been a little bit more tuned in, we would have discovered that there were any number of people around who were going to the Anglican church down the street or
also
whatever.
Trying to follow Jesus, right?
Yeah, but I felt like I had kind of a weird secret. We're Christians, Maybe it was more like the 2nd century.
I was just talking to someone today at church, and they were describing how they're like big preppers. They've got like
canned food in the basement.
Oh, the whole thing. No, and like buckets of things and bug out bags and just doing the whole thing. They've been newer. And I think as they talked, they could see me getting more and more kind of disturbed.
Yeah.
And
what else do you have in the basement?
Yeah. And I was kind of just fishing it out, and they just were more than happy to tell me about different kinds of gas masks you might need. Anyway, just goes for a while. And finally, I think they could tell I was like a little afraid and confused by it all. So finally, this is how they ended that little bit. They said, it's all crazy right until it's not.
That's right.
And it really hit me
That's
like,
true.
If something did happen, I probably would be calling them.
Yeah, exactly.
So there is, to your point, there is something powerful about preparing yourself to kind of stand alone in a certain way.
Yeah.
That is really weird right until it's not.
Yeah.
And so as culture shifts and things happen, if you're really centered in a certain way of understanding your life with God,
right,
that's pretty useful.
Oh, I definitely think that's true. I mean,
I'm not advocating being a prepper for what it's worth. I sort of thought that was sort of the punchline.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that, but
going on Amazon right now to get a gas mask. But
exactly.
Actually, it's an interesting example though, because there's great benefit in being prepared to, as you say, stand alone or stand up in contexts that feel oppositional or hostile. But the difficulty is that you can easily forget to build the fabric of a community in that context, right? We're actually meant to rely on one another. We're not meant to stand alone.
Right.
And even in the context of small churches, I think it's very important that we, just for our own health, that we stay connected to not only the wider body of Christ, but the wider culture that we live in. Right? I mean, and of course there's any number of examples, right?
Yep.
You don't need a Christian electrician. You need an electrician who knows how to fix the electrical systems
or
in
heart
your
surgeon.
home.
Yeah,
exactly.
Totally.
And I think sometimes we can leave the world behind in ways that God has asked us to not do.
Well, and so for it to be, when I think about then your journey, you're in this kind of marching around the living room doing Father Abraham, wearing your little blazer, you have your rock collection. Now you're in South Jersey.
Yeah.
Slippery when wet and street hockey.
Yes. Maybe we could play a clip of Living on a Prayer.
Ooh, wow, 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 wow. So to think that all of that, so all that's happening.
Yeah.
It would make sense why you might be like, I might need a new way through at this point.
Oh, the moment I got to the U.S., I had one job. Remember, the 9-year-old fifth grader with the funny voice who doesn't know even, I thought there were 5 bases in baseball. I didn't know anything. I knew literally nothing. And I was kind of a smart and snarky little kid who was used to knowing everything.
Being clever.
That was my jam, was
Totally.
I'll tell you, and so walking into an environment where you know nothing when that's your tilt is not great. So I had one job, lose the accent, right? Kathy, my wife, has always been disappointed about this because she would love it if I sounded like a Brit because I would at least sound smart. But
do you have even one word, phrase, vocab thing that you find yourself being British?
Well, when I was back, I don't, and I'm
gonna watch for it from now on.
Well,
there's got to be one.
Oh, I'm sure there are phrases. I mean, in terms of the accent, the accent I think is fully gone. Although I was just in the UK for a week for my uncle's funeral, and I noticed already things were immediately the accent starts to come back. Todd Kennedy, my friend who's a pastor at Elm City Vineyard in New Haven, used to make fun of me because I said squirrel instead of squirrel. He's like, did you just say squirrel?
Yes.
And there's probably a few other things like that.
Sure.
I used to, but they're gradually going away.
But you're immediately thinking, I must become another kind of person to be here. Yeah.
Oh, I knew it in my bones, and it was profoundly alienating. I mean, I was walking into rooms where what I was trying to be was somebody that I wasn't.
Yeah.
And then it got even weirder because the immigration is just hard. And even if you move to a place where you speak the same language roughly, or if you're you're okay, everybody has a job, even under those conditions, it's hard.
Yeah.
And I think, one of the things that my mom and dad really struggled with was a sense of loss that they hadn't calculated about what they had left behind.
Yeah.
My parents are in their 70s now. They live up the street from us here in Denver. My mom still thinks of the Lake District as home. And it was beautiful recently to be there with her, sadly for my uncle's funeral, but just to watch her in that environment.
When she lived there, the last she would have resided there would be...
Oh, probably in her 20s.
That's a long time ago.
It's a long time.
For that to still be home.
Oh, yeah. But the landscape, place matters so much.
Yeah.
And we move around like it doesn't. And of course, sometimes you have to, and there's all kinds of reasons to move different places, but it does, like, places take up residence in your heart and your imagination. Anyway, one of the things that was hard was that sense of loss. And so one of the things that became important, somewhat regrettably, in my family was that I speak with an English accent at home. So Kathy, my wife, her family's Vietnamese. Very, very common that you would speak your native language at home and then English at school or out and about. But for me, it was the same language in two different ways.
Just a different accent,
Two different accents.
Totally.
In different rooms. And so I would just flip. I became like bilingual. My mom used to say you're bilingual because I'd flip into American whenever I was with Americans. And I'd speak English at home, English at home. But the problem was when my friends and my parents were in the same place, I found myself, first off, unable to talk. Hugely, acutely embarrassed at an internal level. That your
brain starts breaking.
But then I also became an expert in thinking of words that sounded the same or close to the same in English or American English. So it was a whole thing. It was a lot of work to be little Caleb in those kind of ways.
That is a lot of work.
It really was.
Yeah.
It really was.
Yeah. That makes me think a lot of things about like what kind of skills you learn too. The ability to translate quickly.
Oh, yeah.
Can be helpful. Yeah.
Oh, well, I think it's just objectively the case that the ways that you get shaped even in your dysfunction also become some of your advantages.
Totally.
Right?
Yep.
And I think the aphorism, right? Your greatest strength is also your greatest weakness. But like, as I've grown older and, done some therapy and thought through some of these things around family and had more talks with my parents about it, I think I've become, very much more aware about the whole breadth of how formation in those sorts of circumstances basically creates in very fundamental ways, not your whole personality, but it shapes you into who you're going to be. Mostly in unintended ways.
Yeah, you don't calculate them.
No, exactly. You can go to school and learn how to be a lawyer, but these things come to you whether you like it or not.
Yep. So then you end up in boarding school, right? When do you go to boarding school?
Well, I did 5th grade at the public school, got in a lot of fights. Parents thought that it would be better for me to go to a Quaker school. So in the Philadelphia area, there's really in the Northeast, but especially in Philly where the Quakers settled. There's a very extensive Quaker school system, kind of like a Catholic school system. And I went to one of those, and they're very like values based. It's sort of like Montessori-ish in certain ways, but they're also excellent schools and not too expensive generally. So I went to a Quaker school for middle school, and essentially it was one day just decided, not really in tons of consultation with me. It was decided that it would be good for me to go to a boarding school, a prep school, I think.
And did your parents do that growing up?
No.
Oh, so this isn't like a family tradition, this is what we do.
No. My parents, I think, were dealing with some regret about the I don't even know if it was regret. I think my parents were trying to give me the very best education that I could get, and I think they believed that the best way to do that was to put me in to elite schools. Now, there was just an article in the New York Times recently about how the best way to get into an elite college is to go to an elite high school. So there is some truth to the advantages that gives you. There are some disadvantages as well. The primary one among them being that you are a teenager and you don't live at home. You live at school. And in my view, it's really good for most teenagers to be with their parents.
To be in a family.
Exactly.
Right.
But with the best of intentions, my parents decided that that would be what was good for me. And so I applied to a few schools and ended up being admitted to a school called the Lawrenceville School, which is in Lawrenceville, New Jersey. I mean, it is super fancy. It's like going to an elite college.
Yeah.
But I was 13 years old. I was actually 12 when I left. I turned 13 pretty much right away. And 13 years old, freshman at a boarding school that is like Dead Poet Society. I mean, it's like central casting, red brick buildings, you know, people who have like, they use the word summer as a verb. Like, where do you summer? Like, I don't even know what that means, right? My parents were, you know, solidly middle class, but we weren't wealthy. I was on scholarship, but they were really sort of challenging me to use my brain as effectively as I could to kind of get ahead in the world. Yeah. Didn't work out though. I mean, it may have worked out now. I don't know.
What didn't work? I was going to say, what does that meaning?
So funny.
Meaning?
No, yeah,
meaning you didn't learn to use your brain.
I should explain what I mean. It didn't work out in the shorter term. I've used my brain since, subsequently.
Good.
But the truth is, I just wasn't at all prepared for the challenge of that. I don't know how people get prepared.
Just being alone and crazy world.
Well, yeah. I mean, I got sent off. I was already disoriented. We'd already moved from England to the States. I had only been in the U.S. for 4 years.
Right.
And the thing that was like becoming home was then reoriented, and I'm living in like a dorm, like a college dorm.
Wow.
But in high school. And, you know, it came with a lot of challenges. Also, I just wasn't equipped internally. I didn't have the work ethic or the kind of internal motivation or awareness of what would be required.
Yeah, reading. You have to read. You do all this all your own.
Yeah, you're doing it all on your own. And I think, okay, if I'm really honest, I think that the immigration puts you into a kind of state of emergency for a while because you don't know what's around you. Right. You're in like a kind of fight or flight or freeze condition for a long time because nothing's familiar. And so in that context, it's pretty hard to be self-motivated around creative enterprises. It's hard to know like what you're meant to do and how you're meant to do it. And for me, I'm sure it shows up in lots of different ways for different folks. But for me, I just think my brain was just hyperactively working on how do I be me and where do I fit in this world. And it didn't allow a lot of space for doing the work that I needed to do. And so I ended up failing, I think, 3 classes my freshman year, which was greatly more than disappointing. It was highly problematic. I ended up losing my scholarship to the school, which, you know, my mom, in kindness, real kindness, decided that she would go get a job to pay for my school fees. So now I'm like doubled down, right? I mean, another way to go might have been to just pull me out.
Yeah, be done,
say,
right.
Why don't you come home, smarty pants, and think about if maybe you can pass your classes.
Totally.
But that's not what happened. So I stayed at boarding school for the entire time.
Wow.
Yeah.
And when you think back, it was mostly just social, emotional pressure. Like I just can't.
Yeah, I think so. I think I was disoriented, honestly. And I think that I hadn't gotten to the point in my development as a young person where I was able to take the things my parents required of me and make them my own.
Right.
And so it's a kind of a lethal combo when it comes to getting your biology grades, you know?
Totally.
So I remember feeling like the guy Paul describes in Romans 7, right? That I want to do this.
Yeah.
I totally want to do this. Like, why wouldn't I want to do this?
Right.
I want to please my parents. I want to succeed.
But
I want to do all those things.
Can't get the engine started
but
somehow.
I can't. Like, I don't know how.
Yeah, totally.
I remember my dad, my sweet dad, came to see me in my dorm my second year that I was there. And he brought a binder of like a calendar binder. And he'd print it out like every single day with my classes on it, and he's like,
what to do.
He's like, here, you can just fill this in. You can, make sure you take time for yourself, like have fun, go play some sports and play music and do whatever you want to do. But if you have more control over your schedule, like strategically,
right. You're just not organized
systematically, then you'll be aware of what you're missing as it like floats down the river by you.
Right.
And I was like, oh, thanks, Dad. That's so kind. It's so generous. I mean, he like worked on this thing.
Yeah.
And then I remember watching him drive away, and with no malice and no rebellion in me, just realizing I literally can't do that.
I don't know what that is.
I don't know how to take the next step. So it didn't get a ton of use, the binder, sadly.
Well, and it's amazing now knowing you. This is why this is so interesting to me. Like, I think we determine pretty early, way too early, if kids are academic or smart or capable.
Oh, totally.
Just way too early.
Mm-hmm.
Like the thought that you are this kid that they're like, I don't know if this kid can be here. This isn't going to work. But
yeah,
I mean, you can imagine as a teacher just being like, nah, man.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are lots of reasons that people struggle.
Right.
Right. And I think we have very, very few barometers and metrics by which to measure how well someone is doing, especially in a culture that's obsessed with success and obsessed with college.
Yeah, metrics and performances.
Yeah, I mean, your only barometer for how you're doing, if your goal is college, is grades in classes. But there's very little discernment around that, right? It's just like, well, work harder. You got to do this. Again, it's kind of a fight or flight mentality, or sink or swim would be another way of putting it. I mean, that was definitely an image that got used quite a lot. And I'm like, well, gee, I guess I'm going to sink. I mean, I'm trying to swim. Am I here to sink? And you can imagine what that does to like a 13, 14, 15-year-old mind.
Yeah.
Watching other people succeed and wondering, why can't I do
What's wrong with me?
Yeah, totally.
And so can you remember how is faith working at all in this window? Like, life with God.
There's laughing. So many. I mean, the reason I'm laughing is the answer is no, not really. But I would call back the fact that I knew that there was God, and I knew at least enough that God was interested in my life in some way. And my parents had told me, we named you Caleb for a reason.
Right.
Like, so I'm like, okay, well that was just latently in my mind. But I entirely checked out of going to church, and there was no, as far as I knew, Christian fellowship on campus.
There's no way to do it, right?
And I had no like active life of faith. And my parents really wanted that for me. Yeah. The reason I was laughing is I remember one time, it was Palm Sunday, and they were like, so like, did you go to church today?
What are you doing? Right.
And I just lied. I mean, there was a lot of lying going on. This is a major problem. Again, I'm trying to figure, who am I? What am I doing? So I just say, oh yeah, it was great. And they start asking me like one question
what happened?
About it. And
what was the sermon? Yeah.
Well, and it just is instantly
what did
clear
you wear? Yeah, right.
If I went to church, I would know that every single person was waving a palm frond around, right? But I had no clue what they were talking about.
Right.
And they were very disappointed.
Like, what kind of church didn't do the Palm Sunday thing?
Why are you lying to us? And there was a lot of lying. Because I just honestly, it was like I was formless and void.
Right.
But the Spirit of God was hovering.
Well, that's what I was going to say. What then begins to drop it? How do you start to go, wait a minute, this is real. I got to.
Well, I mean, it was years of crisis first. So like the entire first 3 years of my time at Lawrenceville, so freshman, sophomore, junior year, were just riven with catastrophe, right? It was failing stuff. I was like experimenting with all kinds of like problematic things. Yeah. Of various
as
sorts.
Kids do in that age when they don't know what they're doing.
Age. Yeah. And I mean, regrettable doesn't begin to cover some of the ways that I still even think about how that went. And I also began to develop some really good friendships. I mean, one of the stories of my life is that I've always had like a crew, like a close crew, especially since I came to the U.S. And close male friends has been a thing for me, especially. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know why. It feels like a gift to me from God, and maybe it's part of my personality. But so things were getting better socially. They were very difficult academically. And the bell just rang one day, and I was like, oh my goodness, I have to apply to college soon. Now, again, remember, I don't know what the American college
I'm not used
system
to any
is.
of this.
I don't know anything about any of it. My parents went to a college in another country, and the degrees were all different, and
Totally.
blah blah blah. So I realized I'm going to have to start doing this, and I just panic. I just hot panic, like, oh my God, what am I going to do?
Right.
And the answer was something to the effect of, well, honestly, it's almost too late.
Yeah.
I mean, I failed probably a total of 7 or 8 classes in my time there, and everything else was C's and D's, right?
Right.
And so when I realized college is coming, it was not good. I've got to somehow shape up in some way. I went home the summer of my junior year of high school and went to a church camp. Because I would go to church, of course, with my parents when I went home. There was a youth group, and I had some friends in there, and I went to a church camp, and I responded to a presentation of the gospel. There was a guy called Mike Kwiatkowski, who I've never met since, but he was like my camp counselor, and he talked to me about Christian faith and in a way that I could really understand and connect to. And I think I was also just getting to the point where the crisis was becoming overwhelming. It was like the pain of changing was less than the pain of staying the same.
Yeah.
And I felt like God might be able to help me. And I will say this too, in spite of the fact that I had no active life with God, music was always important to me. And there were some bands that I liked that sustained maybe my prayer life. Some of the kids in the church were into bands like Altar Boys. There was always like these Southern California sort of alternative Christian scene. It wasn't the kind of Nashville scene, but there, so it had some edge to it, which I liked, because I was playing music a lot. And that sustained me some. But anyway, point being, I go to this camp, I have this encounter with God, and I'm like, you know what? I'm going to go back to school. Senior year, I'm going to kill it. It's going to be amazing.
Yeah.
I am going to, I'm going to cease all of my bad habits of various sorts, and I'm going to work really hard, and I'm going to get straight A's, and I'm going to go to college. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to get into college. And that lasted a couple weeks.
So your moral improvement program,
my moral improvement program totally and completely failed.
What a shock.
It was not successful. But one thing I did notice that year, I noticed that senior year that I was a leader. And the reason that I noticed was because the guy who was each of the houses that we lived in had like a president, right? And the president of our house got caught drinking, and that meant you immediately invalidated your political life.
Right.
And so you had to resign.
Yeah.
You had to hold a press conference and resign.
Right, totally.
Like the blobfish.
Yeah.
So I had been elected vice president because nobody else ran.
Nobody did.
No one else ran. I stood unopposed for the office of vice president of my dorm. And then this kid was no longer doing
now
it. So
you're president.
Now I'm president.
Yeah.
Exactly. And part of the job of the president was to plan the prom for the school. All the presidents of the dorms
So great.
got involved in prom planning. And so I remember walking into a room, and I had very strong opinions because I was a muso, right? It was like, this better not suck. We're going to have a good band.
If we're going to do it, let's get it right.
This better be cool. And it's like the mid-90s, so there's all the like drama and angst around music and scenes. And, I was all in that. So I'm like, I just had this band. I'm like, we're going to have this band, or I think we should have this band, and I think it should go this way, da-da-da-da-da. And I just watched as the room was like, great, let's do it. And I was like, wait.
Is that all it takes?
Why are you listening to me?
Somebody just...
I thought for sure we wouldn't do this.
Yeah.
And we did. But it's a small example, but it was an eye-opening.
It's a big one.
It was an eye-opening moment for me, because I realized, wow, if you like think things through, come in with a plan, have credibility, are kind.
Right.
People will listen to you.
Are willing to follow through.
People are willing, exactly.
Do some work, right?
So I got the band that I wanted for the prom, and Yeah, and it was good. But I also heard that year from my college counselor that I should not apply to college that year. She's like, sorry, dude, it's too late.
You're not
going to happen. You need to go to another senior year. And in prep school world, it's kind of like redshirting in the NCAA. In prep school world, it's called doing a postgraduate year, which sounds very
way better than
way
red
better
shirt.
Than barely failed.
You did such a bad job. Do one more year. That's a way better way of saying it.
Yeah, so I ended up going to another boarding school for a year. This one was in Connecticut. Again, I mean, I recognize like how ridiculously privileged this whole thing is.
Sure,
but it was just the life I was living.
Yeah.
So off I went to Wallingford, Connecticut, to a school called Choate Rosemary Hall, and repeated my senior year with one job. I had one job, which was to get good grades.
Enough already.
Exactly, so I could go to college.
Right.
And that's what happened, actually. That's exactly what happened. I went to Choate and started to study hard and try to focus on my work. And while I was there, my parents asked me one time, please go to the Christian Fellowship. And I said, okay, yeah, I'll go one time just to honor you. But I can tell you the kind of people who are in these things. This is going to suck.
Yeah, I don't want to go.
Yeah,
right.
It's not going to be good at all. And I know that like I have like a budding life with God in a real way now, even though my moral improvement plan was a complete catastrophe. I will try. And so I showed up at this Christian Fellowship meeting, and boy, was I wrong. I had no idea what I was walking into. It was not at all lame and terrible. I've said this before, I think on Adam Russell's podcast, but like in the movie version of my life, I would walk in the back of that chapel, and there's music in the front. And as I walk from the back to the front of the chapel, I can feel something happening in my body.
Yeah.
And I don't know what it is. And I'm crying. And by the time I get to the front of the room, and I'm literally going, what is this?
Yeah.
Now, that's sort of as I imagine it happening. It was something like that.
Right.
I had a profound and powerful experience like immediately. It found out later, and this is not a Christian school, by the way. It had a chapel because all prep schools have chapels. But the Christian Fellowship, it turned out they were playing Vineyard worship songs. They're playing Arms of Love and Refiner's Fire. My people who went on to become dear, dear friends. And so I sought out the faculty advisor of that group who lived on campus, because all the faculty live on campus. His name was Eric Eitel. And I knocked on his door, and he opened the door. And when he opened the door, before he said, hi, or I remember you, he opened the door, and his first words out of his mouth were, God is doing something wonderful in your life. And I mean, again, it would be hard to overstate how unusual that is for, a prep school. This is not the place that you go to find Jesus,
right,
or to have your faith stirred. You don't go there to have it killed. It's just unusual. It's just really odd. But Eric was very, very generous, very tuned into the work of the Holy Spirit, I guess, in my life at that time. And he saw what was happening to me. So I just said, well, that's very kind of you to say. Like, I was hoping to, do you guys go to church?
Right.
Can I please serve
what do I do?
some more?
Right, yeah.
And he's like, yeah, we have a van. We drive down to Church on the Rock in New Haven, Connecticut. Pastor Todd Foster of this multi-ethnic sort of urban church in New Haven. Wonderful place. And so I started going down to church every Sunday with Eric and this crew. And
your parents have to be ecstatic.
Oh, they're so
this
thrilled.
Is the very best.
I mean,
thing
once
ever.
they figured out it's not a cult, they're like, this is the best, right? They're like, can it be this good? And they're like, wow, it actually is. So there I was, Church on the Rock, and I would, cry through the worship, listen to the teaching, go for prayer a lot. They would often have prayer, more like in the altar call mode, but it was, prayer. And then we go to Friendlies. Eric would buy us Friendlies. Always got the big ice cream,
Yeah.
And then back to my dorm to try to get into college.
Yeah, exactly. Keep grinding.
And I did that for like 12 weeks, and I realized, oh my gosh, like I am permanently changed. Something
so great.
Fundamentally different is happening in my life right now. And it was Kingdom of God was coming in my life.
Well, and sure enough, you get good grades, by the way.
I did get good grades.
Yeah, that helps.
Well, I got into the University of Chicago. I applied to 12 schools.
Yeah.
And I got into 2. One was my top choice, which was the University of Chicago. And it was my top choice because they studied great books. And I thought, I don't know what else I know, but I definitely know that I don't know what I don't know.
Right.
So I want someone to tell me how to learn how to think.
Yeah.
Right. I got to get like out of this spin cycle of just trying to please people. So let's start at the beginning and go to the end. That's why I wanted to go to Chicago. And to most people, by the way, that sounds terrible. So it was actually pretty easy at the time to get into the University of Chicago. I think it had a 40% acceptance rate.
Oh, wow.
And at that time, it's way
like
different now.
5 or something.
Yeah, it's
now.
way different now. But they like the college catalog was like a phone book. It didn't have any pictures in it. It was in black and white. It was like pulpy paper. And they just said, you'll know who you are if you want to come to this place. And if you don't, you should probably go somewhere else. And then I was rejected everywhere else. Thank God, because it allowed me the chance to go and do that program and study, which was just fabulous. We can talk about that.
Yeah.
But so, I got into the University of Chicago. Some of that leadership stuff that had been growing started to happen in the context of that Christian fellowship. So I started to lead worship, playing music with my friends who were all different kinds of Christians. There was like a Latin Mass Catholic. There were, evangelical types. There's sort of mainline types. We're just doing this thing together. And I also occasionally got asked to speak. I actually preached my first sermon that year on Mother's Day in 1995 at Gateway Christian Fellowship in West Haven, Connecticut.
Wow.
And Pastor Brian Simmons, who's now famous or infamous for doing the Passion Translation of the Bible, was a wonderful and kind person to me. Now, I actually don't, the conversation about the Passion Translation can and should be had, but it hurts me when I hear people kicking him because I remember who he was to me.
Yeah.
And you can separate what people do into all the right boxes. I'm not endorsing the Passion Translation. I'm just saying he was a kind pastor to me in a moment when I needed that. So I'm always grateful for that. And he let me preach and people came to faith. It was people who came to faith, including one kid who was like a nominal Muslim. His family was extremely wealthy, and he came from one of the smaller countries in the Middle East. And he was asked to speak to the school as one of 5 students who reflected on their experience at the school. And he was sort of known as like a kind of a bad kid. You know, he was like a wild child kind of thing. He was a real cool guy. But when he got up to speak, instead of doing the thing they expected, he talked about Jesus to the entire school in a very controversial moment. So there was all kinds of effects of this. But I'm just going, what vortex am I in?
I guess you can do this.
Well, just think, like a year ago, I was in a moral improvement program that wasn't working. And then a year later, I'm like walking around campus listening to Vineyard worship tapes, getting asked to preach in churches. Crying because I can feel the presence of God like all the time. It was like the grass is greener. And, there's so many stories. I don't have time to tell you all the stories of getting, Eric took me down to Pensacola, Florida to his family's little church, and someone gave me prophetic words and prayed for me, and I was filled with the Holy Spirit. And it was just like the world opened up. Jonathan Edwards, who I would later study, talks about how people who are converted by God live with a divine and supernatural light that comes into them, or a new sense of the heart is another language that he describes, where he said it's like the difference between describing the taste of honey and actually tasting honey. Right? That was happening to me over time in a leadership context. So I wasn't just knowing God, but I was getting poured into and pouring out.
You're doing it.
As like a 16-year-old, 17-year-old young person. And boy, was it formative. I was so grateful for all of that.
Yeah. Well, and we were talking last night about the miracle of a person like that serving in that way in that kind of context. It's And my story, the kind of sovereign way that works. Like all of a sudden, all these people are swept into a thing.
That's right. Well, there was a time at which 100 people were coming to the fellowship. And this is a campus of 800 or something.
It's incredible.
That wasn't every week, but my goodness, what is that?
That's a huge impact.
And so in the middle of all of that, The Toronto.
That's what I was going to say, because then you've been listening to worship music,
Yeah.
but then the Vineyard stuff
Yeah. So, I
accelerates,
mean,
yeah.
I'm going to Gateway Christian Fellowship and occasionally to the New Haven Vineyard, which was pastored by Bill and Lainey Elander. And somehow got my hands on a copy of the River Is Here tape and the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord tape
Yeah.
and Light the Fire Again tape,
Dude.
Touching the Father's Heart. And these songs are songs of renewal, especially The River Is Here song. It's David Roos, it's Andy
Oh, yeah.
Park, it's Brian Dirksen,
Yeah.
it's Cindy Rethmeyer's on some of that too, I think. And I remember hitting play on the tapes, walking around with my Walkman, in the dark, crying.
Yeah.
What is happening to me?
Yeah.
And I'm starting to put together, and someone gave me Changed by Your Glory as well, the Langley Vineyard tape
yeah.
from Vineyard Canada, or from Langley Vineyard in Canada. It was just arresting.
Yeah.
It's arresting. I literally didn't know what I was becoming. I'm on a fast train to some kind of change.
Right.
And I love it.
Yeah.
But I don't know where this ends. And in the middle of it, my parents discover from their friends in England, there's this thing called the Toronto Blessing that's happening in Toronto. They should go. So they go. Long story short, they go. They're totally blown away by their experience of renewal. And they call me up and they say, well, now that you're in college,
Ish. Right.
now that you're in
Yeah.
college, we would be willing, because we think this is historic, what's going on in Toronto. We would be willing for you to defer your college acceptance for a year and spend a year at what was going to be the first school of ministry at the Toronto Airport Vineyard.
Wow.
And so I'm like, yeah, for sure.
Let's do it.
So
right.
Chicago's kind enough to let me defer. And then off I go to Toronto. And boy, it was iterative. Let's say that.
Yeah, I was going to say.
We were living in a hotel, three people to a hotel room. So it was like 2 beds and a cot kind of thing. We were the cleanup crew. We were asked to do all kinds
Prayer,
of stuff.
worship.
Well, that's it starts with cleanup.
Oh, I see.
But
Okay.
then eventually the church is realizing, gosh, these people are going to be helpful. So I'm leading worship every single day in the school. And then a couple times, in the big church.
Yeah.
I'm praying for people in the big church 3 to 4 nights a week, I think. We're getting teaching from the people who came to speak in the evening renewal meetings that ran Tuesday through Saturday. We're getting teaching from them in the mornings. And I'm leading a small group. I mean, I'm doing like all the things of which like a ministry life consists, in the power of the Spirit, because God was doing so many incredible things at the Toronto Vineyard at that time that I was able to, it was almost just like, it was supercharged.
Yeah, it's the 10,000 hour thing. I mean, I think about how many folks I'm in ministry with that they have this little window like you're describing.
Yeah.
Often 18 to 25, somewhere in there.
Yep.
Where it's like, this is just what I'm doing. You know, they live somewhere in particular, like in a ministry house or in a program of some kind. And even if they're going to college, it's like, hey, nights that were free, we were together worshiping and praying or going out and talking to people about Jesus.
Right. I mean, I had that like over and over and over again. So I had the year at Choate, which was ministry oriented.
Yeah.
And I had this year in Toronto, which was profoundly ministry oriented. And it was also the height of the renewal.
Yeah, it's like,
so this is a time when like
popping
on a Tuesday night, there's like 1,500, 2,000 people just like hanging out in the building, waiting for God. People from all over the world and all over the church.
It's incredible.
Every night they would say, what continent are you from? There's someone from everywhere. What denomination are you? There's priests. And it was like everybody coming to meet with God in this profound and powerful way. And then I left there with a little prophetic word in my pocket that college might involve my first church plant. It was perhaps when you go to college, it'll be your first church planting experience. And there was a little warning, like don't get too connected to campus organizations because you might be needed.
Right.
And so I headed off to Chicago and within a year was involved with Rand Tucker and the core team of the Hyde Park Vineyard church plant coming out of Evanston Vineyard. Jordan and Sonia Seng's small group became the kind of seed in the ground of Hyde Park Vineyard, which is there to this day doing ministry. And what an amazing investment that was.
Yeah, you're in the middle of all that, and of course you meet Kathy there, and
Yeah.
and then of course then you go to Yale, and you plant a church there almost on accident.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah.
Right after Chicago, I had developed a ton of questions, really, essentially, and a ton of interest in, how do we get to the church that we have?
Right.
I think I started to discover like a historian sensibility when I was in Chicago, because it was always like left foot scholarship, right foot church life.
So, but talk about that a minute. So, because again, when I hear about the arc of your story, you're going for the extra senior year to just get into college.
Yeah.
When, I'm serious. When's the first time you're like, I think I'm good at this, or I like this, or I want to do this?
There's a big difference between I like this and I think I'm good at this. I don't think I ever thought I was good at it. I'm not sure still that I am. But I discovered a different kind of love for learning at University of Chicago, because I was being taught by teachers who believed that texts can teach you things. Right? So the kinds of classes that in my particular concentration, which was called fundamentals, issues, and texts.
Okay.
Right. The kind of classes we would take would be a class on a book.
Right.
So and it would be like a class on St. Augustine's Confessions.
Right.
And what you would do in that class is you would read the book. You wouldn't read about the book. You wouldn't read St. Augustine's history. You wouldn't read other books. Weren't getting lectures about like what were the politics in Hippo at the time. Or it was, no, let's read this text.
Read the text and talk about it.
As if we can learn from it.
Right.
Now, there are obviously merits to like doing all the other stuff.
Sure. Right.
But in that particular formational moment for me as a young person learning how to think, I wanted to move around with people who understood the world and shaped the world differently, right? Like reading, it was like reading with mentors, just dead ones, I mean.
So you think it was the style of learning that woke something up for you?
Definitely. And to give credit where it's due, the very first time this happened was my first senior year. I took a class on Moby Dick. Yeah. And it blew my mind apart. And that was sort of the beginning of what I guess would be like an intellectual awakening that went along with the spiritual awakening that was happening. So those things were really of a piece for me. It was the intellectual life and the spiritual life together. Yeah. And then I just came to discover as I'm reading in, the tradition of sort of the Western intellectual tradition, which is what most of my particular work was in, that a lot of these people had been church leaders. Right? Like the church had produced a ton of really significant thinkers in philosophy and in science and in history and in any number of things, obviously theology and as well. And it just gave me an imagination for the connection between Christian faith and, like, in the best sense, like humanities. Yeah. Right. I saw that like these disciplines are connected, which of course totally makes sense. I mean, if we believe that the Lord
made the people,
people, it should fit together. But there's a kind of fundamentalism or a kind of, even frankly, there's just a tilt in certain parts of evangelical culture, which hadn't really been mine exactly, but it was in the water a little bit to wonder what's the point of doing all this kind of thinking if what you're really made for is ministry. Why would you spend your time going to that kind of school or doing those kinds of classes? I just had none of that, and boy, it just lit me up.
This summer, Vineyard USA is hosting our national conference, Making All Things New, at Ridgecrest Conference Center just outside of Asheville, North Carolina, from Monday, July 31st to Thursday, August 3rd. We're creating an experience that will be great for the entire family, adults, teenagers, and kids, as we focus on evangelism, church planting, and global missions. Registration opens to the public on February 8th with early bird pricing, so make sure to check out vineyardusa.org to learn more and register today. See you on the mountain.
I think I can honestly say, having even done all this honors stuff in high school, I don't know that I ever read a whole book. I'm just being honest. Like,
fair enough.
I would read it to just enough to do what I needed to do. In other words, school felt like a game that I was trying to just get through.
Right.
Like a maze or a gauntlet.
Yeah.
And my experience is not that different. And it coincides with having some encounters with God. That's what's interesting, is how much of that stuff is being woken up by the Spirit, in that you're spending less energy just surviving. You actually have some energy to consider the world
totally
and be interested in ideas or what would God want to do.
Yep.
And mine was, it wasn't a believer, but a philosophy class. TA just walks in and just literally writes on the board, and like the classic TA, philosophy TA in every way, like long hair, Birkenstocks, patchouli, the whole thing.
Yeah.
And just writes on the board in chalk, "Is there a God?" And just turns and goes, "What do you guys think?" This is literally first things.
Wow.
And people just sit there. He's like, "What do you think?" He's like, "Well, this is my name. This is what we're doing. But this is what we're doing." And it just kind of kicks off, and people start arguing. But then we're like, okay, now we're going to read this text, and we're going to come back and ask this question again.
Yeah.
And it was the first time I thought, you can learn like this? Like, I'm not just like memorizing.
You're not trying to win a game.
Yeah, well, exactly. I'm not just trying to, because what they were trying to do is actually teach you.
Right.
It was like one of the first times I experienced that.
Yeah.
I wish I could say that was my entire college experience.
Yeah.
It wasn't. But in this one school of thought, which I think now looking back, maybe it's because I had a proclivity toward that. That's why I enjoyed philosophy. Or no, it was actually the first time I actually thought someone was trying to teach me.
Yeah. I mean, I think a big part of what happened for me was I realized during that year at Choate that my life was going to be completely determined by my encounter with God that I was having. And that meant that whatever I was going to study had to have some connection to that. And for me, it was actually drilling into understanding God and the world sort of head on, right? You could do that and decide you're going to be a biologist, or you could do that and decide you're going to go to law school or whatever. But for me, it was always, as you use the phrase first things, to me, it was that. It was like, let me just get to like the first principles of all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And it also helps to be a kid in the 90s in the sense that there's a kind of like suspicion of everything combined also with a little bit of like, we can do this. Right. I think now people have a suspicion of everything, but they're just overwhelmed.
Not sure it can be done either.
Exactly. And so that's a different kind of problem that requires a different kind of treatment.
Totally.
But for me, that was the journey. Yeah.
But the reason because I didn't know that little bit about you, and it's similar to mine, like, for those who are actual teachers.
Yes.
Like, either it's in a church context or you're a school teacher or, I don't know, in a management position.
Yeah.
The power of like taking people to first things, like having them actually think about what the heck we're doing here and why this is the way it is.
Yes.
Asking good questions, facilitating certain kinds of environments. And I understand Sundays, especially if you're a preacher, doesn't necessarily lend itself to that.
Right.
But creating the other kind of context, like, hey, let's just sit around in a room somewhere and work this Bible text, or ask some questions about why people wrote it this way, or what could that mean for us, or is doable.
Well, it is doable, and it's, there's an interesting combination of things that you need. You need, on the one hand, to be able to tell people they're going to learn from this text. On the other hand, you also have to be able to tell people that they need to work hard to learn from it.
It takes some effort, right?
But you also need, like, and so they have to be taught. There's a way in which having a teacher makes a difference.
Yes.
But people also have to believe they can do it.
Yeah.
Like, part of what was amazing for me was to realize I can do this.
I can do it. Right.
I can totally read St. Augustine.
Yes.
And I might not understand hardly anything right away.
Right.
But the more I do and the more attention I pay here, I'm gonna actually get on the inside of this.
Totally.
And pretty soon you discover it's like, swimming or riding a bike or something.
Yes.
Pretty soon you discover, oh, I'm on the inside.
Yes.
And,
I can learn this.
Yeah. And that's just an incredible gift.
That's cool. No, it's just interesting to think about kid just trying to get to college becomes kid going to Yale, Princeton,
Yeah. Well, I think if I hadn't been trying so hard to get to college, and maybe if the whole thing wasn't oriented around that, but it was oriented around the love of wisdom and the love of God, things might have looked different.
Yeah, quicker road. Yeah,
right, totally.
Shorter, less in between. Okay. Yeah. So we could talk forever about the church planting experience and but where I'd like to try and land it, now that we can kind of hear your story, tell me about how you think about pastors, vineyard people being educated. Like, what is it? What are we trying to do when we think about being A&D of theology? You've been going around, we've been saying the same little phrase about be, know, and do.
Yeah.
That's what we're thinking about when we think about leaders and people in the vineyard, even just disciples. What are you thinking about? Maybe just be starting there with be, know, and do. How are you thinking about education in the vineyard?
Well, I think we're in an interesting moment right now where we're starting to address the questions around what is a vineyard pastor and what's a vineyard church.
Yep.
And bringing clarity to those things in, thoughtful, discerning ways. Those are not questions to be answered as much as they are sort of dialogues to be had. And we can bring clarity around the answers to the questions, but those are never questions we're going to stop asking, is my point, right?
Yep.
And so to work towards answering those questions, I think that we have to become cognizant that there are things that a vineyard pastor in a vineyard church should be, and there are things that a vineyard pastor should know and a vineyard church should know, and there are things a vineyard pastor and vineyard church should do. The work that's required, as I think about it, the work that's required to start to get to answers around what those things are is very consultative. I mean, it's a lot of listening. We have to do a lot of listening to hear what are the things that the Lord is actually wanting to define around those, right? I mean, it would be catastrophic to just sit down and write a list, know?
Right.
And I think a lot of what we're learning about how to lead in the vineyard in relationship to how things have perhaps been in the past is that we want to be much more attentive to like what's growing out of the ground as we discern. Then once we're doing that work, anything we say a vineyard pastor should be, know, and do, or a vineyard church should be, know, and do, we have to resource whatever we would require.
Yep.
Right? We have to resource whatever we would say this is us.
Yep.
And so in one sense, education for the vineyard needs to orient around those kinds of things, right? Yeah. But the trick is that, like, when you answer questions like that sufficiently, you're less in the realm of training for a lot of that stuff and more in the realm of education, right? Yeah. So training would be, how do I do a thing? Fair enough. Right. We can get real practical all the time. I think we should always be practical.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes we've avoided the education side of things because we think to ourselves, that's not practical, but really that's not pragmatic.
Right.
I think we've confused the value of being practical with a need to be pragmatic. And in fact, I think we're in a moment in our culture and the development of our movement where it's important for people who are in Christian leadership, not just to have answers, but to learn how to think.
Yeah.
So
That's what we were talking about with the process of education that changed for you even.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
interesting how it's rooted in your own story.
Yeah, I think that we have to be creating environments that cause people's, pastors and leaders, imaginations to fire around the kind of questions that sound very, very simple. What should a vineyard pastor be, know, and do? But in fact, connect us to the church across time and space. They connect us to fundamental questions of human existence, fundamental questions of contemporary culture. They connect us to debates, right? And things that should remain debated. There are things that are not problems to solve, but they're tensions to manage, as you often say. And I think, Stanley Hauerwas, theologian who used to, maybe still does teach at Duke, he makes this claim that, theological tradition is really an argument sustained over time, right? And I think he gets that from somewhere else, McIntyre maybe, but just that tradition is connected to argument, or, the more peaceful among us might want to just say conversation.
Right, totally. Discussion.
But
right,
the difference between discussion and argument is that arguments make claims.
Yes.
Right? And so to the extent that we believe we want to be connected to tradition, we have to be able to be in environments where claims are made and contested.
Yes.
And sorted through and discerned. And we talk about, what is within the frame of Christian tradition, and specifically what's within the frame of vineyard identity, as we are being called, we, the movement, are being called to steward and embody that identity. So it's funny how quickly you get from a simple sounding question like, what should a vineyard pastor be, know, and do, to the need for a pretty substantial amount of intellectual work. And so I think that there are layers at which we need to speak to these questions. Again, always practical and always discerned and consultative. But, at one layer, we're talking about equipping and simple things for small group leaders, right? How do we read the Bible, right? And you have to be able to speak in simple, sort of concise ways for folks who are like, look, I'm just leading a small group. I'm not trying to get a PhD. Just help me out. But then in order to do that kind of work, we also need people who have given their lives to study, right? You can't get into, tradition as a conversation or an argument unless you've actually immersed yourself inside of that. So you and I were just at Society of Vineyard Scholars meeting this week here in Denver, and we heard an incredible talk from a professor named Han Luen Concert-Comline. She teaches at Western Theological Seminary, interestingly also on Augustine, which is just a coincidence. I'm not pushing Augustine, but we had a talk from her called "Going to Church with St. Augustine," and she did 10 minutes, on who he was and what he was like, and then she said, "Okay, everybody stand up." And the women are moving to the left. And she's like, "What's happening?" And then the men moved to the right. And then she set up 10 chairs in an arc, and we're sitting in the chairs, and we literally reenacted a church service that St. Augustine would, like one that he would have done. And we preached a St. Augustine sermon. People are responding in the manner that the citizens of Hippo would have responded to his preaching and so on. And boy, I just
it was powerful.
It was a powerful thing. And I realized in the moment that she was doing that, the only way that we get all this immersive practical learning is if there's a person facilitating it who's given their life to understanding what this is.
Right.
And so I was so grateful to Han Luen for that, and also aware that you can't have one without the other. I don't think we can have simple equipping around questions like how do we read the Bible or how do we pray for people, etc., that are flexible and well-formed enough to actually help people, unless we also have folks who are giving their lives to doing the work. So I'm super grateful to any number of people from the Vineyard in the US, Canada, UK, South Africa, and around, all over the Vineyard, who have discovered a sense of call to the life of the mind, to study, to get their PhD or their DMin or even just an MDiv, where they're committing life and time to say, how would a vineyard thinker think about this?
Well, and because of your training, your gifting, the call in your life, you embody all those things from the kind of work you've done in the academy, but then also you're, a Toronto worship leading gap year kid. It's a pretty bizarre set of things put together, frankly, for your story. And we were having dinner with Mark Laberton, who is president of Fuller, and he just kept pointing that out, like, Caleb, you have all these unique things that come together, and how does this work? And then you kept going, I don't know, it just works for me. It's I don't know how else it could work without it all.
Life that I have,
right? Exactly.
But I think what Mark was asking, was really around: are there tensions that you find impossible to manage?
Of course.
And I think that my sort of the starting with a sense that love of learning is connected to desire for God.
Yeah.
And that's part of what it is to be a human being.
Yeah.
Helped me so much.
Yeah.
Right? I think that it's just been such a gift to not feel like I have to fight battles around whether these things should be connected.
Well, in the presence and the power of the Spirit therein for you. I mean, having known you.
Totally.
And so he's coming from a world where he's going, these things seem opposed in people I talk to, like people who move in the power of the Spirit talk about seminaries or cemeteries or whatever. And then people who are in the seminaries are going, these kind of wacky folks that say they think maybe they see a picture of someone standing in a purple cloud or whatever.
Totally.
Are just lunatics.
Yeah, exactly.
But because of your experience, those are inextricably connected.
Well, inextricably connected. And it turns out, I think, probably the first fruits of the future of theological education more broadly.
Yeah.
I mean, the world is Pentecostal. The Christian world is Pentecostal.
Yes.
Or charismatic, or however you want to put it.
Yes.
And by the way, so also is the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, and the Anglican Church. So most traditions have never forgotten this stuff entirely.
Yes.
And I think we're in a space now where even standard issue evangelical or mainline seminaries are becoming aware that the reality of people's lived experience is that God is active and at work.
Yes.
The Holy Spirit is speaking.
Yeah.
And so therefore, we have to become aware of how we might incorporate that into our actual learning styles, into our classroom practices, into the formation of pastors. And I mean, it's all the people you're reading in the classrooms anyway.
Yeah.
Now, it's also helpful to think about what would be the right kinds of limits to that, ways of discernment, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
Again, all also available within the tradition if we pay attention.
Yes, if we pay attention. And that's what I think is so powerful about the work I think you're trying to do and we're dreaming about in the Vineyard is we're not imagining the Vineyard as appearing in Southern California as some disconnected form of church in 1980 or whatever.
Yeah.
But no, we're a part of a thing God has been doing for thousands of years in different expressions and contexts. But we're standing with, you said it a moment ago, with the church over time.
Yeah, totally.
Which is not a small thought, because when people start hearing us say things like, well, we're watching what's emerging and what is it that God is doing among us and how do we discern that?
Yeah.
What people who are of a certain disposition here is, you're going to
you're like,
do something crazy.
Yeah, totally.
Or something that's in radical discontinuity with what I've known.
Yeah, no. I mean, the church is not like a mushroom that pops up from the ground overnight, right? I mean, the church is a field. Like it's the whole field.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think the closer we look at even Wimber, right? I mean, John Wimber's, you look at Power Evangelism, like the whole appendix in the back is basically a survey of the history of the church.
Yes.
And healing.
Yep.
I think it's if not, it's Power Healing, but the one that has the appendix in there. Wimber certainly didn't understand the Vineyard as being anything other than connected to the historic church, which proclaims the gospel historically understood.
Yeah.
And, there's a lot to say about all of that.
And there will be a lot to say.
None of this is simple, right? That doesn't mean like, well, duh. All I'm trying to say is that we're not making things up out of thin air. We're standing on the shoulders of giants. Not just giants. We're standing on the shoulders of martyrs.
Yeah.
Right? The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church.
Yeah.
And if we can learn to live with that in our bones, I think we will become the kind of people who can steward the gift we've been given.
Amen. Yeah, we've been handed treasures.
Yeah.
Well, I'm grateful. I mean, I have a sinking suspicion you and I will spend hours in moments like this in front of microphones talking about any number of topics.
Oh, man, isn't it great?
It really is, actually. Well, we do when there's not microphones, so
great gift.
It'd be great to have a few around if it would be helpful to others. But because there's any number of ways to parse what we're describing in relationship to church history, or in relationship to the nature of Scripture, and the relationship of what we think ecclesiologically about the church, and how does authority work and flow,
we have to.
and blah,
listen,
blah.
The moment we think that these conversations are done is a dangerous moment.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we have to do this work. It was just listening to Austin Ivory speak. He's a guy who wrote a couple of biographies of the Pope, the current Pope, and he's worked with the current Pope on a new book called Let Us Dream. He was talking about how the Pope thinks about change, and there's some really interesting thoughts in there. But the primary thing that stands out to me for right now, he's like, the first principle of all of it is that reality is greater than ideas. Reality is greater than ideas, by which he means that if you want to listen to God, you must listen to people in their actual situation. If you want to be discerning, if you want to be helpful, if you want to lead in a manner that's worthy of the gospel, you don't start with abstractions. You don't start at 30,000 feet, or I'm on the left, or I'm on the right, or because when you start to create those abstractions, what you're doing is you're dehumanizing people with whom you need to have encounter. Now, once you've had that encounter, then there are tensions that you need to learn to hold, and then you need to ask the Lord, what is he saying? And then at the end, of course, leaders have to make decisions. So it's not like, we're just going to sit around encountering each other.
Right.
But if we don't learn how to start there as the premise of pastoral theological work, I think we miss something massive. Right? We need to be able to sit with the people in our churches who are struggling in any number of ways because of their social location, or their various orientations, or their identities. I mean, there's so many pieces that need to be heard in order to be discerned about and attended to in leadership. So we don't start with fundamental dogma that forecloses on conversation.
Yes.
We have to be able to do all the things.
Engage people where they are.
And I really hope we're going to learn how to do that well.
I have faith for it.
Yeah.
Well, and I think you're the person to do it, Caleb. I've said over and over, I think God has given you favor for a time such as this for our movement. Grateful for you.
Thanks, man.
Yeah.
It's good to do this.
Yeah. Well, we'll keep doing it.
All right.
The We Are Vineyard podcast is a production from the team at Vineyard USA. If you've been enjoying the podcast, here's a few ways you can help us. Leave us a review on the podcast platform of your choice. This helps more people find us. Connect with us online for additional resources. Our website is vineyardusa.org, and we're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at VineyardUSA. Thanks for listening. See you next week.